Okay, so we are now adding and subtracting with rational expressions. So 5.1, we talked about simplifying rational expressions, multiplying and dividing with them, and in 5.2 we reintroduce the idea of a least common multiple, and we get into adding and subtracting rational expressions. So really, the main thing that we have to pay attention to, besides whether are we adding or are we subtracting the rational expressions, we really have to pay attention to that denominator. So when we were multiplying and dividing, it didn't really matter if the denominators were different, but when we're adding and subtracting with rational expressions, it does. So this idea of adding and subtracting rational expressions has actually going to be broken up into two parts. So this part is the part with like denominators. So we do need to make that distinction that we are adding and subtracting rational expressions with like denominators. See if I can get that to tighten up and get a little less blurry. So we're adding and subtracting rational expressions with like denominators. So just as when you were in school, and what I mean by that is way back in middle school there when we were first learning to add and subtract with fractions, because that's what a rational expression is. It's just a fraction with some x's in it, letters and all those awesome, amazing things that make algebra our favorite. We have to be really careful about those denominators. So if you recall, if I have two fractions, let's say a over c, and I'm adding another fraction with the same denominator c, then to add those two fractions, the very first thing is I write it over the like denominator, right? So if you notice, that denominator didn't become 2c. I didn't say c plus c. I just said, oh, it has the same denominator. So the denominator of my sum will also have a c denominator. And then the numerator will simply be the sum a plus b. So we keep that like denominator, and then we simply add the numerators. So that's if we're adding with a rational expression. If we were subtracting, right, then we would simply, same thing, we keep that denominator, but we would be subtracting the numerators instead. So let's drop down to these two examples and let's look at that in action. So we do want to make sure before we proceed, okay, that's a W, that's a W. So the very first thing I like to do when I notice that is I literally go down and I will write over W. So I remember that is now the denominator of my sum, and I am adding. I know I'm adding because they stuck a plus sign in between those two rational expressions. And so now I get to take my numerators and I get to add them together. Now this numerator is a monomial while that numerator is a binomial, so I am going to put that second numerator in parentheses. So this is going to be some module 3, adding and subtracting with polynomials. It's going to come back to you. So 5 plus, that's 6 plus w, or if you want to think about it in this case, we're simply combining like terms here. So it's still over w, but now 5 and 6 is 11, and then we've got that plus w, because we can actually just get to drop those parentheses because we're not multiplying by anything other than the number 1. So that's going to be 11 plus w over w. Please do not, I repeat, do not try to cancel these w's. Remember, this can be considered a factor of that denominator, but that w is not a factor, it's a term. Remember, when we simplify rational expressions, they have to be common factors. That's not a factor. That plus w is not a factor. It is a term. So you cannot cancel it. Don't do it. Refrain from doing that, please. Okay, so let's hop over to our subtraction. X plus 5 denominator, x plus 5 denominator. So I'm good to go there. So I know the denominator of the difference is going to be x plus 5. And then I simply am going to subtract the numerators. So they're both binomials, so I'm going to put them in parentheses just to be clear. And that looks like a module 3 subtracting polynomials problem up there in the top. So you do have to be very careful with this one. Remember when we were subtracting polynomials, I allowed you, or one of the techniques that I suggested was to change it into an addition problem. But remember, in order to change it into that addition problem, you had to change the signs of that second polynomial. So it was a positive 3x, now it's a negative 3x, it was a negative 2, it was a positive 2. So if you're going to change that sign to a plus, you've got to change the sign of every term that follows that plus sign. And so now it's just an addition problem. So division and subtraction, we usually like to change them to their opposites. So 10x plus a negative 3x, that's going to be a positive 7x. And then 3 plus positive 2 is going to be a 5. And again, it almost appears as if we have a common factor of x plus 5, but that 7 is not being multiplied by the quantity of x plus 5. It's simply being multiplied by the 7. So this is a 7x plus 5, and this is an x plus 5 in that denominator. So nothing cancels. This is the simplified form of our difference. All right, next video is going to be adding and subtracting with unlike denominators. So we're really going to get to use that least common multiple coming up.